Hello and welcome back. We are in module 11 now. In this module, we are looking at the relationship between brain development and the concurrent language development. So, till now in through last 3 lectures, we have looked at the first language acquisition and tried to understand how the developmental stages of language co-occurs with the developmental stages of the human brain. We looked at the developmental stages of the prenatal brain and then the postnatal brain in the infancy of the children. How the major developments, major milestones that are crossed and how they are they seem to correlate, they seem to have they are co-occurring, though we are not exactly sure that whether there is a cause effect relationship between them, but they do co-occur. So, for example, we have seen that some major milestones like the burst of naming, word naming, similarly after some time between around 20 months onward, the burst of grammatical categories, they seem to co-occur with certain important developmental milestones of the human brain as well. So, in this regard, we have looked at synaptogenesis, which is the creation of synapses, which starts just before birth and this continues, but the largest amount of synapses are built around 8 to 9 months gestation period to the early part of life. Of course, this goes on throughout our life, but it kind of tapers down and the rate is not that high. So, synaptogenesis was seen with respect to the language development of certain types, and also we looked at the frontal lobe metabolism, which is considered to be another important milestone in terms of brain development, and this also seems to co-occur with the another watershed moment in the language development. So, till now we have talked about this. We have also looked at, we also know that perceptual narrowing happens around the first year, around the 10 months onwards, 10 months to 12 months, the children's ability to categorical perception narrows down. So, in the beginning they are able to distinguish between sounds in all kinds of languages, native language, that is their own language, as well as other languages. However, around 1 year of age, that capacity seems to narrow down, which is called the perceptual narrowing. Now, on the surface, perceptual narrowing might look like some sort of a developmental regression. Regression as in regression is opposite to progress. So, looks like we are going back. So, initially they started their life with a higher capacity of distinguishing sounds of various kinds. So, speech sound versus non-speech, within speech also various kinds of subtle differences they were capable of making, but that after a point that seemed to go down. So, does it mean that there is a regression that happens? As per scholars, that is not exactly how it should be looked at. Perceptual narrowing actually indicates a more efficient processing of the salient environmental cues. For example, that is the time when we have talked about the various kinds of environmental input that the child learns. We looked at implicit learning in the previous lectures, where the child environmental input, linguistic input makes them narrow down on the appropriate phonetic and phonemic contrasts in their own language. So, that narrowing is important in order to focus more on the native language. So, that is what the scholars are saying, that this is actually not a regression, but it is a sort of more efficient handling of the task at hand. And interestingly, there are also lot of parallels with this perceptual narrowing along with language. So, within language we have already seen that narrowing happening, but this is not something essentially only a linguistic matter. There are perceptual narrowing that happens in other domains also. So, for example, that is there in case of face recognition. So, in the initial stages, children infants are able to recognize, differentiate even monkey faces, but as they grow up, around the same time when perceptual narrowing in phonemic distinction happens, around the same time they also have a perceptual narrowing on the face recognition. Similarly, music and multisensory audio visual perception and so on. So, there are various domains within which the perceptual narrowing happens. So, this is a part of a larger developmental trajectory that is within which we have to look at this particular feature. Now, let us have a quick recap on the various stages of development that we have already looked at. In the early stages, the brain produces a lot of neurons, many neurons and connections between these which are called dendrites. So, there are a large number of neurons that start with that we start with, and a large number of connections as well. Over time, many of these neurons die, which is called pruning as well. There are many other names that we have seen yesterday, and this connection, this death, neuronal death is also called dendritic pruning. Simultaneously, also we looked at the myelin sheath that comes in, that starts building up, and which is very important, rather important aspect of the development of the human brain, because this helps in better transmission of the electrical signal along the axon. So, these things already have been discussed. Now, there is another way of looking at the development of the brain. Of course, we started with the cell generation, then cell transportation, and then building up the connections and so on. But there is another way of looking at it, which is the which part of the brain gets built first and how does it progress. So, following best we will stick to this this particular way. So, right to left, it starts from right to left, and then primary to secondary to tertiary regions, and then from the basal area to the cortical area. So, even within the cortical area, we have discussed this before, the prefrontal cortex is one of the last things to be last areas to be built. So, sensory cortex gets built first, and then eventually we progress. So, the current brain imaging studies also corroborate with this hypothesis, hence we will stick to this. So, in infants, sensory cortices develop earliest in life. When we are talking about the cortical region, the sensory domains, sensory areas develop first. This is followed by development of sensory bridges in the parietal lobe and motor cortex in the frontal lobe. Most anterior part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex develop the latest among the other parts. So, in case of the brain structure, the anterior means the frontal part, anterior is opposed to posterior, which is the back portion. So, anterior as part of the brain typically refers to the prefrontal cortex, which is the last area to be built. So, changes keep taking place after this also, but does not happen in such a visible way. There are more of a you can call them more of a software updating rather than a hardware building. So, hardware building happens in this way, and it is kind of complete in the early part of life. Now, these stages of cortical developments are important also for word acquisition and later processing of those words. Early words, so why is it so? Because we have already seen that after the child is born, brain is still developing, and now around the time when they are 1 year old, they are already capable of comprehending word as well as they will begin to speak in words. Now, at this time brain is still developing. Right. So, as a result what happens, it is very easy to see the words that they learn in the first part of life, like first part of word acquisition, they will typically be dependent on the sensory motor cortex to be processed, and the words that they learn later, there are chances that they will be the prefrontal cortex will also play a role. So, that is what we are getting at in this particular segment. So, early words of infants might show dependence on those cortical parts that develop early, that is around the same time, and the later learned words on the later developed area, which is prefrontal cortex, as we have just said. So, this has been investigated not only in monolinguals, but also bilinguals. In case of bilinguals, we are looking at the question slightly differently, but let us start with the monolinguals to give you a basic idea. So, now the main question that was asked is, if there is a parallel between age of acquisition of that is language acquisition and the brain's developmental stages. This was a hypothesis that the initial stages of the words may be dependent on the initial structure of the brain. So, that is the hypothesis. Is there a dependence, mutual dependence of this sort? In other words, how processing of one's native versus second language reflect the dependence on different areas of the brain. Now, why is this important? This is important because when you talk about second language, we are typically talking about a language that comes in your repertoire after the first language is already in its place. So, there are particular age brackets which we typically take into consideration. Typical cutoff will be 3 years, around 3 years, though we do not really have a very airtight compartments anymore, but around 3 year onward, this is a spectrum. So, after 3 years we can safely say if you are learning another language after 3 years of age, then it is your second language, right. So, as a result of which it is very easy to see the first language and its the brain the region where it is processed, second language the words of second language and where it is processed in the human brain. So, these are the main ideas that we are talking about. So, native language processing is that sign basically means this has a correlation with the areas that develop earliest in the infancy, because native language is what is the first language that you learn. So, that those words will be processed in those areas. Similarly, L2 which comes in any time after 3 years of age. Now, when we are talking about L2, we have to remember that we are talking about both child as well as adult L2 learners. We will see the finer distinctions later in the section. So, L2 as of now L2 means both child and adult L2. So, L2 that comes in which is after 3 years of age, that can be processed in those areas that develop later. This is the question. Now, this probing this question will also answer the question of the sensitive period for language learning, which we have already discussed before, that the critical period hypothesis which is also called sensitive period now. If we understand this, if we see a direct correlation between brain areas and the kind of developmental trajectories that the language learning follows, and whether they are similar between L1 and L2, then we will be able to answer a lot of questions in this domain. So, in second language it has been reported that L1 which is first language, AOA before about 6 years or an L2 which is after 7 years are represented differently in cortical areas. 3 years and 4 years are slightly difficult. So, we have most of the researchers have taken a breakup after 6 or 7, but when we define second language we typically go after 3 years. And there are at least 2 major factors which have been pointed out when we talk about the the localization of L1 versus localization of L2 in the human brain. There are 2 factors that have been put forward. This is a domain which is rich with literature, lots of different kinds of perspectives have been explored in this, and out of all that research typically there is an agreement that age of acquisition and proficiency level play a part as to where in the brain the L2 will be localized. Functional localization of L2, which part of the brain will be taking up that responsibility, there is a correlation between the age of acquisition and proficiency level. Age of acquisition means the early bilingual versus late bilingual, and proficiency typically we will look at low proficient versus high proficient bilinguals. So, bilinguals are not a homogeneous monolithic kind of a structure, there are different kinds of bilinguals. So, we will stick to age of acquisition and proficiency. Now, this particular question, this particular domain has been approached from we connecting it to word processing. This early development of sensory motor areas and later development of the frontal lobe functions are the main variables that we have typically been looking at, and words can be processed in different areas depending on when they learnt. So, if the words are learnt early in life versus they are learnt later in life, we will expect them to be processed in different areas in the brain. and this is applicable not only for bilinguals, but also for monolinguals. Children, when they are learning words in their word learning stage, there are certain words that they tend to learn in the beginning, certain words that they will learn much later in life. So, for example, orangutan is not a word that will typically be in the vocabulary of the 1-year-old or a 14-month-old child, but the toy will be something like that. So, that also is visible. Keeping this thing in mind, now we will discuss a lot of findings, many research findings that have been carried out. One of them, one of the older ones is by Morrison and Ellis, 1995. They carried out a lexical decision task on monolingual participants. Now, what is lexical decision task? Lexical decision task is a task where there will be some sort of an input in an input stimuli, which the participant has to look at and decide whether it is an acceptable word in that language or not. So, for example, let us see this is a word. Now, if I have a something like this will be the task. Now, in the first case, in lexical decision task, both words and non-words are given. This is the second example. This one is a non-word, they are called non-words. Non-words are created by slightly manipulating an existing word. So, they are maximally similar to an existing word with minor modification. So, the modification here is the final phoneme, and the when they are performing the task, they will see in a randomized order words as well as non-words. They will have to check whether they are this will have a no response and this will have a yes response. So, this is a word, this is not this is a non-word. Now, this task is a one of the fundamental tasks of language processing research. There, depending on what your probe question is, there will be different kinds of designs. So, in this experiment they wanted to see if age of acquisition plays any role in the processing speed of the participants. So, the non-word, so the no responses were actually not our target responses were the yes trials. So, all the words that were that would elicit the answer yes were the actual trials. The no was just given there because as part of the experiment. Within the yes response set of words, they were divided into either those words that are learnt early or they were learnt later. That was one set. The other set of words were divided in terms of their frequency. So, how frequent those words are in the child's vocabulary. What they found was the result reflected effect of AOA as an age of acquisition, but not that of frequency. So, age of acquisition, depending on if they were learnt early, they were reacted to much earlier compared to if they are learnt later, but frequency did not have a. So, frequency was not a variable that yielded any result, but AOA proved to be an important variable. So, these studies paved the way for many other studies that followed them, depending on where in the spectrum they fall. Similarly, another study was carried out by Hernandez and his group. They found effect of both AOA and frequency in picture naming. So, picture naming is a production study, in LDT lexical decision task is a comprehension study. So, there is a difference that we see in terms of whether it is a comprehension versus whether it is a production and what variable will be important in which case. Similarly, there are other studies, yet another study showed that words learnt in early childhood led to activity in Heschel's gyrus and other brain areas responsible for speech sound processing. So, this is one particular area where early words are found to be processed. Words learnt later relied on brain areas in lower part of the inferior frontal lobe. So, this is exactly what we were talking about. So, the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex gets built later. So, the words that were learnt later were seen to be processed in the inferior frontal lobe. Inferior and superior is the top part, inferior is the part below. So, that area was responsible for processing the words that were learnt later. So, this area is basically reflecting the effortfulness of the processing. So, how if you need more effort to process something, actually a large part of prefrontal cortex is dedicated for control mechanisms, executive function, attention control and so on and so forth. So, anything that requires voluntary control, some amount of control mechanism, some amount of effort is processed there. So, that is exactly what they found. The words that were learned later were processed there. This pattern of processing showed a parallel to brain areas development, that is sensory cortex development preceding prefrontal cortex development and their language counterpart. Task wise difference also. So, reliance on sensory motor processing changes as a function of AOA. So, as depending on when the words are learnt, what is the age of acquisition, the reliance on sensory motor cortex will vary. So, if it is very early, AOA is very early, then more reliance, if it is later, it will be less reliance. That is the that is how it works. So, as brain maturation expands to frontal lobe, individuals process information differently. Deprivation in the early years affects aspects of language, some aspects of language more than others, that we have already seen before, that when you talk about the critical period, deprivation in this case will be those words that were not learnt in the first part of the in the early years. So, that is so they were deprived of the sensory motor cortex processing. So, in those cases some certain parts of the grammar and phonology will be affected, but not the entire language. So, this what this means is that different aspects of language are differently sensitive to age. Not all aspects are sensitive, but certain aspects are sensitive to age. Now, neuroimaging studies on bilingual brain looked into this aspect as well. We have already discussed some of the neuroimaging techniques. So, some of them we will discuss now. Some of the studies using those techniques will be discussed. One study, for example, used PET, positron emission topography, showed that native language led to a wider area of activation, while later languages involved a very small area compared to. So, the native language, as in the first language was processed over a larger wider area in the brain, whereas the second language involved a smaller domain. Now, the task that they used was listening to stories in their native language and in their L2. The participants were Italian English bilinguals, they had to listen to a story. Then similarly, there are fMRI studies also that followed. In one such study, they asked a group of early and late bilinguals to say in their heads what they did the day before. In their heads, as in just remember, think. Think without speaking, without saying anything, just think about what you did the day before. Now, there were different kinds of prompts given. One cue was the morning or afternoon. So, what did you do yesterday morning around this time, or what did you do in the afternoon? You just have to think, you do not have to say anything. And then while they are at it, what was probed? The area of interest as in exactly the area, probe area. So, in the brain you already have a pre-decided area that you will be focusing on. So, if you are looking at the entire brain, until and unless that is your research question, typically we do not do that, we pre-decide an area of interest. So, you want to see when you are thinking about a certain action, which area of your brain is activated. So, I will propose that let us say Wernicke's area will be more active compared to Broca's area, something of that sort. So, area of interest is already decided as within the experiment design. So, in this case the area of interest was Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Now, in case of Wernicke's area, what they found was, in case of Wernicke's area, overlapping activation as in overlapping for the languages. So, overlapping activation pattern for both languages was noticed for both early and late bilinguals. So, in case that is what happened in the Wernicke's area, in case of Wernicke's area, but in case of Broca, BA is Broca's area, WA is Wernicke's area. So, in case of Broca's area, early bilinguals showed overlapping activation, but in case of late bilinguals, there were two clearly separate, but adjacent areas. So, there is a very clear separation of early and late bilinguals in terms of their processing language in case of Broca's area. So, that is what what we see in terms of the age of acquisition in case of bilinguals. This suggests that when reciting to themselves, early and late bilinguals invoke neural systems that are overlapping in the area of comprehension, but they are not overlapping in case of production. So, because Broca's area is more dominant in case of production. EEG studies also were carried out. So, we are looking at one representative sample from all the different kinds of studies that have been carried out. Of course, there are many more. So, in the EEG, in case of EEG, typically we look at N200, P600 and 400 effects. So, in this case researchers wanted to find out if these components will differ among bilinguals differentiated in terms of AOA. Simply put, if there is a difference between early bilingual and late bilinguals in terms of their N200 and P600 effects. That is the simple question that they had. Now, subjects, what was the task? Task was subjects were told to read sentences that were designed to go wrong at the bolded word. So, they used wrong, grammatically wrong sentences in order to see the effect, because if you remember, we talked about P600 where syntactic errors will be, if there are syntactic errors that you are processing, P600 effect is more often seen. So, that is why they use this kind of sentences. The scientists criticized the maxes of proof of the theorem. That is what this kind of sentences were created. What they found was early negativity was found to be reduced in all learners, but late learners did not show reanalysis of the sentence, which is P600. So, reanalysis was not seen. Early learners between age 1 to 10 showed indication of reanalysis at a later stage. The evidence of later component revealed that early learners perform reanalysis like monolinguals. So, there is a parallel between early bilinguals and monolinguals. Early bilinguals are those people who have learned their second language early in life. So, their processing in terms of the localization, in functional localization in the brain are similar to that of a monolingual. Monolingual in this case means for us native speakers of a language. So, the way you process your L1 is also the way you process your L2 if your L2 has been learnt early in life. That is what the conclusion here is. A follow up study again looked at late learners and native speakers of English. Similar kind of findings they also have. So, late learners did not show early negativity. Late positivity showed was spread across a large area of the brain and extended over a longer period. So, differences between the early versus late learners. There are many other such studies that also confirm this. So, late learners basically what is all of this mean is that late learners use a different mechanism to process grammatical information compared to native speaker and early learners, and between early learners and native speaker there is a lot of similarity. That is what the main finding so far has been. Also, second language learners, even early learners may show a different pattern of processing as compared to native speakers as well. Detecting errors, for example, in grammar in second language relies largely on later analysis. So, there are finer distinctions. A broad distinction is early bilinguals and process their L2 similar to their L1, and late bilinguals process differently, but bilinguals as a whole also differ from the native speakers on certain categories of processing, in terms of their neural signature. So, there are differences even among the early learners. So, then there are of course, fMRI studies have also been carried out, and they found that late bilinguals showed increased activity in prefrontal cortex later near Broca's area, an area associated with speech sounds. Early bilinguals did not show any difference in the brain's blood metabolism. Again, the another study on gender marking fMRI on Spanish monolinguals. The task was to judge whether the nouns presented to them was a masculine noun or a feminine noun, because Italian has grammatical gender like Hindi in India has. So, but there are certain rules as to where the nouns will be, which will get from feminine and which will get masculine nouns. So, for example, regular, so they have regular and irregular nouns. In case of regular nouns, the words encoding in O will take masculine noun, masculine gender. So, this is the word for car in Italian. So, if it is it ends in O, then it is a masculine gendered word, whereas any all the words ending in A will be having feminine. So, casa is the word for house, this is a feminine gender. But the more critical part comes in this language, that there are certain irregular words as well that do not follow this rule. So, for example, all these words that ends with this can be either masculine or feminine. So, you see the fountain and this is all of this. So, fuente and puente both end in A, but this is feminine, this is masculine. So, this is the problem. So, these are part of the list of words that are called irregular words in this language. Now, the task was that this particular experiment used stimulus had equal number of masculine and feminine nouns, and they are also equally divided into regular and irregular nouns. What they found? Results showed that irregular nouns having increased activity in 3 different brain regions. So, anterior insula, superior and inferior portion of this is Broca's area and anterior insula. So, these are all connected to articulation. Additionally, they also found increased activity in these areas. So, anterior cingulate gyrus, which is related to increased cognitive effort, because here you are trying to make sense of, there is an amount of effort that is needed in order to disambiguate what is happening here. So, because of the irregular words, for regular words that is the problem. So, after the experiment, they actually interviewed the participants and asked them what they did, how did they figure out, and they were actually apparently they were searching for the determiner to fit in, and then they made a choice. So, in their head they were speaking those words in their head without being verbally without any verbal output, they were imagining the word. So, whichever kind of looks correct, that is what they chose. So, this basically means that the speakers were mentally creating the noun phrases in their mind with the determiner. So, all of these needed more cognitive effort, and that is why we saw the activation in those regions that are responsible for tackling difficult decisions. So, many other studies have been carried out, similar studies, and they typically the stimulus will be similar, some kind of this kind of division between early versus late learners, and similar kinds of findings you will get most of these cases. So, in this study also early learners showed increased activity in the inferior part of Broca's area like monolingual Spanish speakers, but late learners showed a different area altogether, adjacent, but an area that is more dedicated to retrieval of meaning. So, basically what the gist of the matter here is that age of acquisition turns out to be an indicator of localization of processing for bilinguals. Age of acquisition also predicts the volumetric changes in left anterior cingulate cortex. These are more recent findings that bilingualism leads to actually structural changes in the human brain, and in some cases there are more gray matters, there is an increase of gray matters in certain parts of the brain. Similarly, there are findings in the in case of ACC also, anterior cingulate gyrus, which also has volumetric changes with respect to age of acquisition. So, this is a kind of a dynamic. In case of bilingualism, there is a dynamic relationship between the language, the age of acquisition, the exposure, the number of years that you have spent, and also proficiency. So, there is a dynamic relationship that happens. So, proficiency on the other hand, which is also a very important predictor, was more relevant for volumetric changes in the right inferior frontal gyrus. So, this is where we end with the lecture 4. In the next lecture, we will carry on with the same topic with respect to proficiency, and we will also look up a little bit on the in terms of control mechanisms. Thank you.